What's up? Welcome back to Cyrus King Show. This is your host Cyrus King. And in this episode, you see the title, right, is the concept of Black Native Americans cap. Um, this is a topic that should be simple, but it's not because people really get emotional, people get very disrespectful, people not educated, and then some people have an agenda. Some people, I'm gonna try to make this video as short as I can. I'm realizing the TikTok audience, even on YouTube, has affected it where unless you got some real like stuff to say, people have a 5 to 7 minute attention span. I can go for 45 minutes, an hour easy, right? Um, but I'm trying not to do that shit. And this is an important topic to me because I'm black, but I do have indigenous blood, and more importantly, I mean, I've rolled with. I mean, I've, I've hung with indigenous people all over the world. Indigenous rights is a very important thing to me. So whether it's Australia, whether it's fucking up and down the Americas, North, South America, whether it's even even going to Africa and talk about the Baka and the Pygmies and the Bushmen and making sure those cultures get preserved, or even going, I've been to Siberia, right? I start to say, oh shit, like there's links between Siberians and Native Americans. Like I didn't really know that years ago, right? Um, no matter what, I'm very indigenous cultures and movements are important to me. So this is an interesting topic because it is all over the place. Because I feel like there is a bigger conspiracy on the top, right? Because even for those initiated in Western fraternal mystic orders, right? More at the upper level, though. I don't think you would get that in the lower medium level. They do admit that there's a connection between the Olmecs and the Egyptians and the Sudanese and Nubians, going into even West Africa. They admit that at the top level. Again, at the top level. When you're lower medium level, you don't really get into politics because you're still kind of an outsider. You don't get really into politics as much. The reason why that's important is because Freemasons, Rosicrucians will fit under that banner. So there's no question that at the top, some people know that this is a real thing. But at the same time, it's all over the place because then you get people who say, I'm Native American, I'm not African. Huh? You're not African? If you did your DNA, right? When somebody's from England, Germany, right? Their DNA is associated with that landmass, right? So if you say you're not African, when you take your DNA, who fits your DNA most? Not East Africans, Central, West, and the South, right? Really more the West and Central, right? Depending where you're from, if you're from North America, it's more West. If you're from North America and the Caribbean, it's more West. But if you're from the Spanish Caribbean, it's more like a fusion of West and Congo. And then for South America, it's definitely more Congo Bantu groups, right? Maybe even Angolan. Even though you do have a good section of Angolans in DNA in America as well. So you're not African is ridiculous, right? That's just some self-hate. Now, if you say you're not African culturally, I mean, yeah, you're not kind of. I mean, you still have more traces of Africa culturally than what is commonly known as Native Americans today. So now you get a real somewhat conspiracy mixed in with a lot of ignorance, a lot of self-hate, right? And I'm gonna get this from people who then it would say I don't believe in DNA tests, right? They say I don't believe in DNA tests. You could do that, right? But when you see, that's the thing. When you get into the indigenous mindset is very different than the modern mindset, right? Now you have a lot of indigenous people who are modern now, so they're just like everyone else. But the indigenous mindset is very different. I'll give you an example. The Melanesian people of Vanuatu, New Guinea, Fiji, Solomon Islands, right? Their indigenous stories talk about they come from Africa. Their indigenous stories say that, right? Literally, which I give them a lot more credit than the people over here. People over here in America forgot. This is why we're having this madness, right? Over there, they remember. And you get Europeans who tell them you can't prove that. They don't care because the indigenous peoples depend on our own records. No outsider can tell us where our ancestors come from, where we come from. That's the difference, right? I feel like a lot of people here have never been to a reservation, never did anything indigenous. Don't care. I keep saying it. Indigenous peoples are protectors of land, right? And a lot of our spiritual systems. That's why people have to separate the politics from the spirit. Are you talking about which one? And a lot of our spiritual systems, the land is our ancestor. We're supposed to protect the land. We're supposed to be guardians of the land, and it protects us, right? That's how they operate. So motherfuckers live in the city don't even like animals. Don't even like animals. Like, let alone the plants, the land. The land is a little bit harder than plants. So plants a little bit harder than animals. You don't like animals. You a city person and you talking about you the real this. That can get disrespectful. And it takes away from the real ties, because there's truth to the fact that you're combining. So if you say Olmecs, right? And they evolved eventually to Mayans, right? Okay, that's something separate than if you're had slaves that came over here and then they mixed with natives, right? That's two separate things, right? One was pre-Columbus, one was Columbus. Two separate things, right? Two totally separate things. It looks related, but they're not. And then, so we're all mixing stuff up, and then we don't think about indigenous stuff, so most of us look at them. So a good example, you look at the map, you say North America and South America. Most people don't realize South America is actually closer to Africa than it is to North America. I know you can't tell looking at the map, look it up. It's actually a little bit closer to Africa. So when we talk about the Muslim records showing that there was West Africans in America, some Muslim records talk about that from Senegal and Mali, right? Those guys are going to South America, most likely, right? So that's separate than North America, those related. Then you got the people come from Polynesia, who the Polynesians were the best sailors I've ever seen, right? Making Vikings look like nothing. They most likely went to the Pacific coast, and they most likely went to South America and North America. They had more reach. And with them, you could have had adjacent groups of Melanesians, right? There's people who, in their ancestral DNA, Melanesia will show up like 0.5% or 0.8%, right? Random shit in the Caribbean, right? You're like, huh? They'll show up. Yes, because Melanesians are black looking people, right? I'm just saying, they're not African technically, but they look black, right? So you have that. And you probably had that in much bigger numbers than the people coming directly from Africa, right? But let's just say you include that as black looking people. So you had these two groups come up. Now, they're by no means the majority. The majority is going to come from the Siberian region, right? That's what the DNA shows. That's what the cultural shows. You know what's funny? As much as people talk about Native Americans, no one claims Canada though. Right? The Inuits and the First Nations people up there, no one claims that, right? And all those people are related to some extent, whether you're talking about Eskimos or, I don't like to say Eskimos. The Inuits, First Nation people, come all the way down to the indigenous peoples of South America. There's a slight relation. So there's no question. So is black Native Americans capped? Of course not. Because once you go to Mexico and below, right? Like, see, in North America, I know Mexico is part of North America, but let's say in Canada and America, you're really gonna get the Seminoles like that, right? Which is like the bloodlines where stuff merged together, right? And then when we talked about Olmecs and, right, Mexico, and then you start to when we go into Central America, the more south you go, first of all, reds and blacks have a much better relationship in the South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. Much better relationship than they do in America. So wherever you talk about the Zombos in Colombia and Venezuela, even to Panama, indigenous groups in Brazil, right, for sure. I mean, shit, when I say indigenous groups, I'm talking about indigenous groups. Everybody I'm saying is mixed of black. So the indigenous black fusion in Brazil, right? Right, when we talking about that, those guys had their own communities, literally. And even to this day, there's still some kind of recognition, like they can't be evicted and stuff like that, right? So when we talking about that, or when we talking about the Garifuna, who from St. Vincent mixed with the Caribs, so they know as black Caribs, get kicked out from St. Vincent, go to the Caribbean, We need to go to Central America, Nicaragua, Panama, not as much Panama, but Nicaragua, Belize, Honduras, right? Guatemala, right? Boom. So that's all of a sudden black and indigenous, right? So that's what I say. You're talking about two different. You're talking about two different things when you talk about the West Africans who came here on their own versus the blacks who mixed with the reds, right? And I feel like those two different things have to be said because it's like people all over the place. You can't say the reds are fake when you wouldn't go to Canada, Alaska, right? So the red population, which is would probably come from Siberia, and them, which is modern Russia now, right? You might as well say it's Russia now. They were the majority, right? Everyone else was kind of localized in that sense, right? If you're coming at it from the angle of, and not even who's first, like you coming at it from the angle of some native shit. So the problem comes in is that you have a right to be, because even when you say the Seminoles eventually went to like we have to know the history. Seminoles eventually, some Seminoles went to Mexico. Well, went to Texas first, then went to Mexico. I think they're like Moscagos. I think they call that the Moscagos, right? Even when we talking about like Juneteenth and stuff like that, some of that stuff was coming from African communities in Mexico, because the guys from Florida went to Texas, then from Texas they went to Mexico. And you talking about, again, black Seminoles, so a lot of mixing, right? Mixing with cultures. When you go to Bolivia and go to Peru, especially Bolivia, where they don't have as famous a black community. When you see blacks down there, they tend to be mixed with indigenous, so the cultures are fused together. These things are important because I feel like when people are saying this, they don't have any knowledge of this stuff. None. Like, you see what I'm saying? And so it comes up and when we talk about indigenous, you're caretakers of the land. So yes, the black man in America especially is unique because he came from different parts of Africa and he mixed together. And his unique mix exists here. It doesn't really exist in Africa. So that's why I still have some sympathy when people, if some people say straight cap, I'm like, nah, it's not straight cap because his mix is unique to here, right? For sure. You can make an argument he was born here. You can make an argument he was born here just as much as the red Indian was born here. But the difference is when you get into the indigenous mindset, the red Indian was more plugged into his ecosystem. Indigenous people care about the land. They care about the four-legged family, which is called the animals. You see what I'm saying? They're not in a city just whatever, living an unnatural lifestyle, talking about I'm indigenous. And yeah, there's plenty of indigenous people in cities. There's plenty of indigenous people, and reservations kill each other. Reservations is just as the hood, right? But they still have a memory of a time before. And so the thing is, there's no question there's some conspiracy to it in the sense that, obviously the people at the top don't want people to know that Africans traveled a lot more than they say, right? Even including this part of the world, right? They don't want you to know that. So I feel like emotions have to be managed because a person will hear this video. So I'll give you an example. I laugh sometimes when I see some comments, right? A person will hear this video and they'll be like, I don't know what the fuck this is. They'll be like, so some people will say, hey, they look at the title, right? And they're like, man, first of all, this is the internet. So you're going to get some people who'll be like, is this guy fundamental American, right? So they'll be like, this guy shouldn't be talking about American business, right? Just off that, right? And that's fine. Okay, then you say that, but then what? Then you say we were here first. Like, what is we? Like, are you Israel? Like, okay, the Israelites were here first. What part of Africa you came? Because obviously your DNA is African. So what part of Africa you come from? How long do you come from here? What indigenous? If it's not in your culture, are you trying to actively reawaken your customs? Do you know how much things that we have in this country that's come from indigenous people, from the agriculture, from the avocado, from the chocolate? You see what I'm saying? Do you know how much some type of beans The names of states, Kentucky, Wisconsin, all that shit's indigenous. I think the Taínos even invented the barbecue, right? Cornbread. Like, what's your relationship with the ecosystem? What's your thoughts on environmentalism, land rights, right? What do you think about animals and plants, preservation of that? Is any of that going on in your mind? I'm just saying. Like when people say, well, Native Americans are reservations, we want reservations too. Have you been to reservations? Like, have you seen how bad the reservations are? Right? Have you seen how bad the alcoholic rates are? Have you tried to make your own alliances with those people instead of saying those people are fake? Like, you get disrespectful to the Reds. And I do admit, so if you want to talk about not talking about your business, I do admit, where I'm from, blacks and Reds get along. Like I said, you go below Mexico, it's a different ball game. Up here, I don't know what the fuck you two groups were doing. There was beef. So if you want to talk about that, yeah, I'll talk about that. I acknowledge that. That is a different politics, but at the same time, it's what leads us to what we are right here. Right? So if I say, so you get mad, but if I say, hell yeah, there was blacks in Americas before Columbus, I'm saying it. Why would you get mad? What is to get mad? Do you understand that there's two different groups? There's the groups that came before Columbus, and then there's the groups who mixed in with the Reds. Do you not? I know you're angry, but can you use your brain and see, get the motion out the way? Those are two groups that don't get spoken about much. And if you do say these guys are phonies or whatever, no one, like, this is indigenous. Let's get into indigenous pride. Isn't Canada and Alaska and those places North America? Isn't Greenland North America technically? I think, was that under the Sami people? Do you even know what I'm talking about? If you're the kings, shouldn't a king know that? And if you say they're imposters, so you still should care about that land, where's the black folk up there? You're gonna say it's too cold. All right, so then you want to pick and choose what you're indigenous of. See, I like to make motherfuckers look bad when they get emotional. Because you get emotional and say, I'm dissing you. I'm saying you were here. There was people here before Columbus. At the top level, I said there's people into the conspiracy. Most of you guys have never been around on this shit, never been initiated, never took no oath, never been around anybody who did that, so you don't understand how that works. Yes, at the top level, they do associate some connection. They do acknowledge there's some connection between the Egyptians and the Nubians, and most importantly, the Egyptians going through West Africa, right, which gets tied to the Muslims, which is why the Muslims have a record of it coming to America. They do admit that, and they're not even coming to America. They do admit there's a tie that even lasts to this day. So if that's in the fraternal orders, Freemason, that's the same hermetic structure the Freemasons and Rosicrucians from. So they all know it. It's what they choose to acknowledge. Because the people in academia don't have as much information. They have some information, but there's some stuff that they don't have as much as they... Like, academia has their own caste system, basically. Right? And then tied into, they don't want you to know that you sailed this part of the world. And then, like I said, and then we all black, right? You love to say we all black. People coming in, the Melanesians, accompanying the Polynesians, came here in probably greater numbers. And all that Brazil, all that West Coast, right? That's why Easter Island still has Polynesians to this day. I think Easter Island was the last country colonized. Not on some European ship, but colonized by humans. That's, 3,000 miles from Chile. If we're going to talk about indigenous people, get an understanding of your indigenous landmass. Don't be 80% of you guys in the Southeast and in certain cities, New York, but the Southeast, Texas, certain Chicago, LA, and Oakland, but you mostly locked into one location and talk about America. If you talk about America, you need to spread out, right? And see America and know the land if you're gonna talk indigenous stuff. Because when the dude Charlie Kirk got killed, first thing people say, unalived, I'm sorry, when Charlie Kirk got unalived, first thing people say, there's no blacks in Utah, right? And there's definitely blacks in Utah. It may not be the majority, it may not be a lot, but there's black communities. Like we start talking about Portland, when you start talking about even New Mexico and Arizona, Denver, but definitely those places, right? Alaska. So I would say Alaska, Utah, the top two, where there's black people there. Hawaii, right? But they're disconnected from the general black community, right? And so when you have 13% of the population but you locate you all in one area, you could see it could seem like that 13% is 30, 40%. But there's a lot of other black communities that are disconnected that people don't, they don't, you know, they have less, like, that's why, imagine you black in Utah and people say there's no blacks in Utah. There's blacks in Utah, just not as much as, I mean, what is it? I think it's like 2 to 4% black. You may say that's nothing. That's nothing. Yeah, but I mean, the national average is 13%. I haven't looked it up, but I'm sure when you talk about, like, the Midwest might have Milwaukee, might have Wisconsin, Chicago might have Illinois, but a lot of places the black population is probably like 6 to 7%. So it's, you know, just like you have blacks in Alaska, they know no one thinks about them. When you go to Alaska, black people up there know they're on their own. They have a totally different mindset, totally different connections. Like, they tend to get along with the Inuits and the First Nation people better than the Reds and Blacks in continental America has been, right? But these are all things that there's no knowledge of, and we're just talking shit. You see? I mean, how many people know about the Seminoles going to Texas and then going to Mexico? It was Mascagos, I think. How many people know that? You see what I'm saying? It's just like, yo, we got to do a better job in terms of, like, there is some truth to, yes, the blacks and reds mixing is underrated, for sure. And blacks came to America before Columbus, for sure. And there's no question that when you start talking about North and South America, it's two different animals, though, because South America is closer to Africa. Like, the moral of this video is, if you're going to claim it, get your indigenous on. The indigenous mindset is a lot different than the modern mindset in the city or in the modern world, right? Get that mindset on, especially if you're going to say the Reds are imposters and get disrespectful like that, and then begin to start connecting to other indigenous peoples around the world. And then even if you, man, I like Africa, yo, the Baka, Pygmies in Congo, Bushmen in South Africa, get to know them. Those are indigenous people that the Bantus kind of pushed out to some extent at times. You see what I'm saying? Now there's mergers, like you get a Zulu who'll be like, he'll have some Bushman ancestors or some people ancestors, but he'll be more Bantu, right? It'll be a merger of both. These are things that should be on the table in our minds before we start saying shit. You see? Because I guarantee you there's going to be people who come here mad, and why would you be mad? I literally said, you came here before Columbus, right? But we all black, right? So there might have been some Aborigines and Melanesians who came in bigger numbers, right? They hit Brazil, they hit Bolivia, they hit that part. They like South, and so why would you be mad? South America, obviously, from both sides. In Africa, you're going to come to South America before you go to North America. So hence, when South America and Central America, when you start thinking about it, there's more, the Zombos of Colombia and Venezuela and to Panama, black-looking Native Americans, blacks and Native mixers. The Miskaito in Nicaragua, Native Americans, indigenous people who have black in them. Some actually more black, right? The Garifuna, people know, Honduras, Guatemala, Belize, right? The Santa Rosa community in Trinidad, the Caribs, blacks and Carib mixing. There's still some blacks and Carib mixes in St. Vincent as we speak. We all know about Cuba, DR, and Puerto Rico. The indigenous people there mix more than the indigenous islands. Some people mix with blacks over there, right? So there's definitely links in Peru, right? There was blacks who were Spaniard soldiers, let alone and slaves, who mixed with indigenous peoples. Especially when you talk about Bolivia, too, and even Paraguay. So it's obviously a thing, right? No question. It's obviously a thing. And in Americas, 1 in 5 cowboys are black. And cowboy culture, yeah, we talk about cowboys and Indians, but cowboys learn a lot from natives, and vice versa. So there's obviously links. There's obviously camaraderie and a relationship. There's obviously also rivalries. But most importantly is a hidden history that and cultural gaps that should be bridged before you just pop and shit. Cyrus King. Till next time, peace.